Hello, my name is Pearl McCaney. Welcome back to Revival Lost Southern Voices, a festival for readers. Being presented virtually this year in partnership with the Georgia Center for the Book and Georgia State University Perimeter College. We acknowledge also Georgia Humanities, which from the beginning has offered support and encouragement for the festival. One day during the Decatur Book Festival, Andy Rogers and I met among the book booths and the food wagons and began imagining how we might create an opportunity to share some of the Southern authors of the past. Revival Lost Southern Voices was born then in 2017 with the help of Greg Murray, Allison Law, and many others. Jen Colatasti, Joe Davich, Gina Flowers, Carrie Miller, and Allie Stonewright soon joined the team and worked with the Decatur Book Festival, the DeKalb County Public Library, Emory University, Georgia Center for the Book, GSU's Kenneth M. England Professorship of Southern Literature, and Perimeter Honors Program to make the festival a reality. From the beginning, we considered the literal and figurative meanings of lost, of Southern, and of voices. The voices might be those of writers, artists, musicians of any genre. Southern is also a loosely applied modifier for a voice who is born in, traveled through, lived in the South, or whose work is about the South. South, of course, a geographic concept, is also protean, ever-changing. And lost, the festival seeks to revive the work that may be out of print or out of production, unread or underappreciated, or of renewed significance in our time, as with the writings of Lillian Smith and James Baldwin. The work may be lost because its artist is deceased or no longer writing or producing. To paraphrase P.L. Travers of Mary Poppins renown, that which is lost is waiting to be found. Our presenters have been Natasha Trethewey, Yusef Komunyaka, Tony Grooms, and the late Terry Kay. Among those returning to present to Lost Southern Voices this year are Valerie Boyd, Brenda Bynum, Matt Dissinger, and Jamil Zadeldine. During this virtual Lost Southern Voices Festival, we'll meet via Zoom webinars on Thursday, March 25 at 1 p.m. and Friday and Saturday, March 26 and 27 at 1 and 4 p.m. Each session can be individually registered for via Eventbrite, and each session will have a moderator to introduce the presenters and to facilitate questions from the viewing audience. Titles of books and links to the independent bookstores will be provided should you wish to pursue the work of the presenters or of the lost voices. And to effect a festive spirit, we will have a raffle for books at the end of each session and for a gift certificate to the Decatur Restaurant Revival at the festival's conclusion. Winners will be notified by email. Again, I welcome you or welcome you back and welcome you to seek to enlarge your lives by enjoying and learning about a variety of lost Southern voices.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, Georgia State University Perimeter College, welcome to Lost Southern Voices 2021. We're very pleased to welcome you to the second session in the festival, Condensed Careers, Poetry, Scandal, and Southern Gothic. We will discuss, of course, three particular voices, Ernest Hartsock, Brad Weiss, and William Gay. As Pearl mentioned in her introduction, we will do a raffle for books that will, of course, come from the people who have registered for the sessions, and we'll let you know via email if you're one of the lucky winners. After the formal presentation, if you would like to ask any of the panelists questions, you may either type your questions into the chat feature on the side of your screen, or you may use the Q&A button, which we will find at the top of your screen or at the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. We would also like to welcome you to browse the program that's been created for today's event and for the entire festival. And don't forget that we will have links to independent bookstores where you can purchase the books. Right now, I would like to introduce our three panelists and get this session going. First, we have Eli Arnold, who currently serves as the director and university librarian at the Philip Weltner Library at Oglethorpe University. After he graduated from Oglethorpe with a bachelor's degree in archaeology, he spent 6 years at Oglethorpe's Office of Administration and earned a master's degree in library science from Valdosta State University in 2012. He then spent 2 years working at the Horace W. Sturgis Library at Kennesaw State University. He served as the treasurer of the Georgia Library Association and currently serves on the editorial staff of the peer-reviewed Georgia Library Quarterly, and has presented on instruction and information at local, national, and international conferences. When not assisting Oglethorpe students and faculty members, Eli enjoys researching his alma mater, LGBTQ history, and the American poetry scene between World War I and World War II. Matthew Dissinger is a lecturer in the Department of English at Georgia State University in downtown Atlanta, where he teaches courses in American literature, Southern literature, critical theory, and writing. He edited a collection of essays with Connor Pickens entitled Southern Comforts, Drinking, and the U.S. South, and his work has been published in the Mississippi Quarterly, the Global South, Virginia Quarterly Review, South Asian Review, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, among others. He will discuss the work of Brad Weiss and Lost Southern Voices, and his essay on Weiss's fiction is its reception will be published in the Southern Quarterly in 2021. Dawn Major received her master's in the fine arts of writing from Reinhardt University and a bachelor's degree in English from Kennesaw State University and a creative writing certificate from Emory Continuing Education. She was a recipient of the James Dickey Fellowship and acted as an editorial assistant for the James Dickey Review. She won the Robert Driscoll Award for Excellence in Writing in Regional Themes, as well as the Reinhardt University Faculty Choice Award for Excellence in Writing. Her published work may be found at the 5 Points, a Journal of Literature and Art, the James Dickey Review, Sanctuary Journal, Sediments Literary Arts Journal, and Family Life Publications, a forthcoming work out in Springer Mountain's Summer Slasher Horror Anthology. She has written a living history scripts for Oakland Cemetery's Sunday in the Park event and actively collaborates with artists and other mediums. She is a member of the Atlanta Writers Club and the HWA and provides editorial assistance for the William Gay Archive and gives lectures about William Gay. Her forthcoming book, Bystanders, is expected to be published in the fall of 2021 through Springer Mountain Press. Once again, welcome to everyone, and we'd like to start off with Eli Arnold.
Thank you. Great. Hopefully my presentation's up there. Thanks so much, Joe, for the introduction. Today I'll be speaking on Ernest Hartsock. So just for those of you who may not know, Oglethorpe University here in Atlanta is a small liberal arts and science college. We were founded in 1835 in Milledgeville, Georgia, when that was the state capital. We closed during the Civil War, reopened in Atlanta during Reconstruction, closed again, and reopened at our present location in 1915 was when the cornerstone of the first building was laid. So we're in North Brookhaven. So how did I get interested in Ernest Hartsock? You know, I really like this quote from Zora Neale Hurston about research as formalized curiosity, poking and prying with a purpose. So how did I get interested in Hartsock? We have a bronze bust here in the library of Hartsock. It's created by Fritz Zimmer, Atlanta sculptor and OU professor, the year after Hartsock's death. I walked past it hundreds of times as an undergraduate and librarian and was drawn to the figure in his super brief life and started seeing what I could find out about him. This was hard because he had been dead for nearly a century and anyone who directly interacted with Hartsock would be long gone. But my minor obsession with Hartsock's led to years of research and some amazing friendships. Most of my images are just different pictures of Hartsock, so I'll scan through those as we're talking. Through his little magazine and boutique press, Ernest Hartsock, now largely forgotten, existed at the center of the poetry scene in Atlanta during the interwar period. Ernest Abner Hartsock was born May 3rd, 1903 in Atlanta to Ernest Sr. and Alta Mae Sanner, both from Maryland. His father was not very successful, and support for the family fell to Ernest. After attending the North Avenue Presbyterian Church Grammar School, then Boys High, where he wrote for the school newspaper, Hartsock earned a bachelor's degree with high honors in 1925 and Masters of Arts in English in 1926, both from Emory. While an undergraduate at Emory, Hartsock worked for the Latin department, edited the Emory Phoenix literary magazine, accompanied the University Glee Club, and was a member of numerous honor societies, including Omicron Delta Kappa. He published his first poem in the Phoenix as a freshman, and his editor sought to strengthen the reputation of the Phoenix from simply a college literary magazine to a real force in Southern literary criticism. During his time as editor, Hartsock began to develop his progressive and liberal philosophy of literature and the arts, which would serve as the basis of his writings and literary criticism. In the November 1925 issue of the Phoenix, Hartsock wrote that the magazine was, quote, dedicated to moderate modernism and the establishment of a new tradition if it please you. If it doesn't please you, please speak to the editor and he will make every arrangement to facilitate you in changing your opinion. In other of his regular editorials, Hartsock wrote in support of Scopes and against the recently reestablished Klan. In his senior year at Emory, Hartsock published his first collection of poetry, Romance and Stardust. He also served as the organist at the Palace Theater and Trinity Methodist Church, where he sang in the choir. In addition to the literature, he was gifted in music. In his collection at the Rose Library at Emory, there are also many of his drawings as well. So he was pretty artistic all around. While earning his master's at Emory, Hartsock taught undergraduate courses there in English, and upon graduating was hired as an instructor of English at Georgia Tech in 1926. During his tenure at Georgia Tech, Hartsock founded the Beaux-Arts Press, which would eventually publish about 20 books of poetry. The next year, in 1927, he would found the Little magazine, Beaux-Arts, the bi-monthly poetry review. Little magazines were small periodicals devoted to serious literary writings, usually avant-garde and non-commercial. They were published through the 20th century. Beaux-Arts would become the second largest poetry publication in the country, claiming among its subscribers the upper echelon of the poetry world. Regarding the unique title, Hartsock credited H.L. Mencken. In his 1917 essay, The Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, reprinted in Prejudice's second series in 1920, Mencken wrote that the South was, quote, almost as sterile artistically, intellectually, culturally as the Sahara Desert, end quote. Naming his journal after Mencken's play on the Southern pronunciation of the Beaux-Arts, Hartsock sought to prove Mencken wrong. The same year, he founded his magazine. Hartsock published his second book of poetry. It was widely praised, but didn't make Hartsock any money. In 1929, Dr. Thornwell Jacobs, president of Oglethorpe University, hired Hartsock to teach poetry and literature classes. Always a man of using the most verbose phrasing possible, Jacobs named Hartsock Oglethorpe's inaugural professor of poetics. Jacobs, a Presbyterian minister and minor poet himself, had reestablished Oglethorpe in 1913 in its present location in North Atlanta. Paralleling Hartsock as a publisher, Jacobs was responsible for all books coming out of the Oglethorpe University Press. Based on the success of his journal and notoriety gained by his talks and published poems and reviews, Hartsock was in high demand as a lecturer and guest columnist. He would travel widely across the Southeast, visiting poetry societies and universities offering readings and presentations. Struggling financially his whole life, as mentioned before, he supported his father, mother, and sister. Hartsock lectured and taught until he was ordered to bed due to chronic health problems. The same year of his move to Oglethorpe, the Poetry Society of America awarded Hartsock with its top annual prize for his poem Strange Splendor. Hartsock, being unable to afford the trip to the New York City ceremony, was sponsored by the Atlanta Journal newspaper, for which he had written book reviews. In the post-event recap in the Poetry Society's magazine's next issue, there's the sardonic line, quote, Ernest Hartsock mumbled inaudibly strange splendor. I guess the society preferred it in print. A holy grail of my own research would be an audio recording of the Poetry Awards ceremony, or Hartsock reading one of his poems on the Auburn University radio station. To actually hear him read one of his poems would be just a real find. Hartsock published in the Southern Literary Lantern, the Double Dealer, Fugitive, Circle, Poet Scroll, Parnassus, Southwest Review, and the Greenwich Village Quill, and internationally in Home and Abroad and Poetry in the Play. He would also in life and posthumously be included in many poetry anthologies, some edited by Ralph Cheney and Lucia Trent, who in 1928 edited the book America Reigned, subtitled Memorial Tribute in Verse to Sacco and Vanzetti. Henry Harrison, Benjamin Meucer, and important African-American literary critic William Stanley Braithwaite. Always small and frail and often sickly, Hartsock overworked himself due to his financial obligations to provide for his family. Increasingly worse the last months of his life, Hartsock would have to take a long nap midday, and doctors eventually ordered him to give up typewriting and organ playing. His letters to Glenn Rainey, his best friend from Emory and later longtime Georgia Tech professor and author, became more and more desperate and pessimistic. Those letters and others at Emory are absolutely heartbreaking to read. In October of 1930, his final book of poetry, Strange Splendor, named in honor of his award-winning poem, was published. One of his last letters talks of the joy of autographing some of the copies. Hartsock finally succumbed to pernicious anemia on December 14, 1930, at Wesley Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. He was only 27. Today, he would simply have B12 shots and he would be fine. C. Vann Woodward, one of his best friends from his undergraduate time at Emory, who would go on to be awarded a Pulitzer Prize in history, was at his bedside when he died. Later, both Woodward and Rainey often talked of their close friendship of the three of them. With the successes of Woodward and Rainey, it's hard to not imagine how Hartsock, had he lived, would have lived up to the others' two reputations. Hartsock was buried at Atlanta's Westview Cemetery. No tombstone exists for Hartsock, but a large bronze plaque with his poem Second Coming is there, and his birth and death dates are included on the Hartsock family memorial. Memorials were held at Oglethorpe and the Trinity United Methodist Church, where Hartsock was a member. The Atlanta Poetry Society held a program, the Atlanta Writers Club held a program. Many remembrances appeared for Hartsock in poetry publications and newspapers nationwide, and others sent directly to the Hartsock family and friends. Benjamin Meucer, a New Jersey poet who was in the circle of Ernest's friends, published 2 memorial books in Hartsock's memory, which quoted many of the words of comfort for Hartsock's family and friends. Included is a poem dedicated to the Meucer that Mary Brent Whiteside, Atlanta poet and later editor of Beaux-Arts, claims Hartsock dictated to her during a seance. There was even a brief movement to purchase Hartsock's final home and create a memorial and poetry museum near the Emory University campus. Unfortunately, very few physical remains of Hartsock exist. A plaque, now lost, was unveiled at the main branch of the Atlanta Public Library by the Atlanta Writers Club, of which Hartsock had been president. There's a memorial stone at Joel Chandler Harris's Wren's Nest Author's Walk. The Philip Waltner Library here at Oglethorpe, we have a bronze bust created by Fritz Zimmer that I mentioned, and also a plaster bust created by Atlanta poet and Hartsock friend Blossom Tucker. Luckily, after Hartsock's death, his best friend Glenn Rainey collected most of his papers and donated them to the Emory University archives. Included are letters from to Hartsock from many famous poets, especially those leftist poets during this period, including G.K. Chesterton, County Cullen, Robbins Jeffers, Harold Vanall, Lucia Trent and Ralph Cheney, Jack Conroy, William Alexander Percy, Daniel Whitehead Hickey, Byron Herbert Reese, and Charles Henry Ford. There's also a small cache of Hartsock letters at the Atlanta History Center. After the death of their son, Hartsock's parents transferred ownership of the Beaux-Arts Press and Journal to Oglethorpe. Jacobs and Meucer would serve as co-editors. The quality would steadily decrease, especially under the editorship of conservative Whiteman F. Melton, and would completely cease publication in 1935 when it was absorbed into Jacobs' Westminster magazine. It's easy to predict the career of a poet who died at 27. It can be a very easy trap of the historian or researcher, neither of whom, as opposed to Mary Brent Whiteside's, apparently is prophetic. But I think that if Hartsock had lived, he would have been known name in Southern letters and literacy criticism, maybe as known as H.L. Mencken. Based on his writing and those of his circle of influence, I think too he may have become a force in the progressive arts of the 1930s and beyond. He was openly gay with his best friends Glenn Rainey and C. Vann Woodward, and maybe with Ben Meucer. So who knows how that would have played out in early mid-century Atlanta. There was, of course, an underground gay scene in Atlanta at the time, but who knows if he would have embraced that or turned his back on that. His circle was very liberal, but as the interwar period ended and we entered the Depression and World War II, it became harder to be truly leftist and progressive when you were a member of the intelligentsia. So Ernest Hartsock, though, deserves to be remembered. Hopefully with presentations like this and maybe a republishing of some of his essays and poetry, his forgotten reputation will be revived. And here's a list of the sources I had and, like I said, permanent collections at Emory and Land History Center and here at Oglethorpe. So thank you. And my email address is there if anyone wants to talk after, and I look forward to any questions when we're finished. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eli. Matthew, if you're ready, you can go ahead. Matthew, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of the proceedings again this year, albeit remotely. I'm still really glad that we can get together and talk about some of this fascinating work. So thanks for including me. So I'm going to be talking about Brad Weiss, a contemporary writer. I really appreciated Eli's presentation for, kind of showing his skills as a research librarian. And my, my talk is going to be a little bit of biography, a little bit of analysis to hopefully, make you a little bit more interested in a text that you maybe haven't heard of. Okay. So in September 2005, the University of Georgia Press published Brad Weiss's collection of short stories, The Bear Bryant Funeral Train. Here's the original publication. It was winner of the press's prestigious Flannery O'Connor Prize for Short Fiction. Shortly thereafter, a reader in Weiss's hometown of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, recognized similarities between one of Weiss's stories and Carl Carmer's famed memoir, Stars Fell on Alabama, which was published in 1934. Margaret Butler, a librarian at the Tuscaloosa Public Library, first noticed passages from Carmer's memoir that one of Weiss's stories reproduced, in some cases word for word. Butler and subsequent accusers read Weiss's subtle changes, turning, this is from Carmer, distant high blasts of a bugle into distant notes, high blasts on a bugle. That was Weiss, for example. Readers read this not as a type of sampling used to establish a relationship with Carmer's memoir, but as unacknowledged theft. Weiss maintained that he wrote the collection in the spirit of contemporary historical speculative fiction, such as Don DeLillo's Libra, which fictionalizes the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, and Tom Stoppard's play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which takes place in the offstage world of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Placing his text in league with similar contemporaries was made more difficult by the absence of textual markers that had been present in earlier versions of Weiss's work. In an effort to make his book seem less like academic fiction, Weiss removed a Carmer epigraph that had appeared alongside the story Tuscaloosa Nights, that's the title of his story, and I'll say a bit more, it's the title of a section of Carmer's book. So there was an epigraph that had appeared alongside Tuscaloosa Nights in Weiss's dissertation, but he removed that when it was published by UGA Press, explaining later that the original epigraph was, quote, not intended to deter accusations of plagiary, but to provide a sort of literary rubric for the reader. And that's the end of the quote. Nonetheless, by the end of October 2005, UGA Press had recalled Weiss's collection, revoked the O'Connor Prize, and pulped all its remaining copies of The Bear Bryant Funeral Train. In the wake of the plagiarism controversy, Weiss left his position as an assistant professor of English at Mississippi State University in 2007 and joined the faculty of the University of West Bohemia in Pilsen, Czech Republic. In the years since, Weiss has stopped publishing fiction altogether. Instead, he's focused on criticism, publishing articles on the fiction of Mississippi writer Barry Hannah, mostly, almost entirely. Those essays often explore how Hannah's artistic vision has come into conflict with regional classifications, which emphasize Hannah's status as a Southern writer at the expense of his broader reception, particularly in France. So, Weiss's kind of, point of reference in this work is pretty global, and that we kind of see some of that playing out in the Bear Bryant Funeral Train, the collection itself. But that's sort of just an aside. So that's part of the story of how Weiss's fiction has been lost. Today, I want to dig into the plagiarism controversy itself and discuss what's interesting to me about Weiss's fiction, much of which has to do with the refiguring of what has been called plagiarism. That's what I want to talk about, reconfiguring our thinking about that. We should understand Weiss's work with Carmer as an explicit act of intertextual sampling, in which he pulls phrases from Carmer's writing to introduce that textual world, only to take the reader somewhere else entirely. Rather than attempting to hide its indebtedness to Carmer's memoir, sampling announces a type of conversation between texts. And I'm using that word, sampling, which I think we're probably most familiar with in the context of music, where it happens all the time and establishes a kind of dialogue, right, that we think of not as an act of theft, but as a kind of a communication. And Weiss's fiction uses that conversation to explore how foundational understandings of the South as an exceptional and different space within the nation and a disconnected space from the rest of the world actually crumble in the contemporary South that Weiss's characters move through, allowing us to reconsider the South's more long-standing entanglement in national and even global cultural currents. So before I get into all that, I just want to pause and say, what I'm trying to get us to think about a little bit is how, not only do I think what he did was sort of not plagiarism, it's also kind of essential to his project as I think about it, and very justifiable and even pretty complex and interesting. So before I get into that, I want to talk a bit more specifically about the relationship on the page between these two texts. So Karl Carmer's memoir, which I should say, it was published in 1934. It was exceptionally popular when it came out, but it's not a book that a lot of people read still to this day. And I can say a little bit more about that in the Q&A if folks want to talk about that. But yeah, Stars Fell in Alabama, a memoir by sort of a New York journalist published in the 1930s. So his memoir begins with a section titled Tuscaloosa Nights, and that's like the end of the day, NIGHTS, which is going to matter in a second. So in that section, Carmer, with the help of a local guide, attends a Ku Klux Klan rally, which ostensibly he really did because this was a memoir. The rally appears in a short chapter entitled Flaming Cross. That chapter begins. This is a quote. "We heard them coming long before we saw them, 3 distant high blasts of a bugle, then a drop of a minor third on a long wailing note," unquote. The edition of Weiss's collection published by UGA Press begins with a story entitled Tuscaloosa Nights, KNIGHTS. So nights, end of the day, nights like with a K, right? And that story, by the way, was originally published in GSU's own 5 Points Journal, just as an aside. So in Weiss's story, starting with Tuscaloosa Nights with a K, seems to me to on its own introduce a fairly obvious dialogue with Carmer's Tuscaloosa Nights with an N. Weiss's story opens, quote, "And that's how it began. 3 distant notes, high blasts on a bugle, then a drop of a minor third on a long wailing note. It sounded like an English fox hunt. We heard them coming a long time before we saw them." So Weiss's seemingly obvious references to Carmer appear to establish, not conceal, a discourse between his fiction and Carmer's nonfiction. Such a discourse is somewhat common in contemporary fiction, which is very often interested in the world that texts make, in textual history as opposed to capital H history. Weiss's story highlights its textuality from the outset, announcing through its title and these opening lines that it will explore the effects of accessing the South through texts, which is a big part of what the collection as a whole does. The story's play between its own textual reality and Carmer's was obviously not read in that spirit. But a new edition of Weiss's collection that was published 2 years after the original was pulped, newer, I should say, it's now about 14 years old. That edition included an introduction by Weiss, an acknowledgement of the text's sources, and 4 essays in support of the project by other writers. Weiss explains in this second edition, this is the edition of the text I'm referring to, is published by River City Press out of Montgomery. He explains in the second edition that he wove passages from Carmer's texts into his own, quote, "because my story is meant to look and feel like Carmer's world, while remaining an alternate universe, a virtual recreation, a postmodern commentary on the primary text," unquote. Where Carmer positions himself first and foremost as an observer and recorder who is sort of decidedly outside the realm of participation, Weiss speculates about deeper historical contexts of the cultural practices that Carmer sort of pretends to display with objectivity, right? We're moving from nonfiction to fiction. So he can play around a little bit in that world in a way that Carmer doesn't. Weiss's collection not only crystallizes many of the social meanings that Carmer just points at, but it also allows us to return to Carmer's text with new eyes and think about, what it does and what it fails to do. It's important to note that Weiss's fiction interrogates the version of Tuscaloosa offered by Starsfell in Alabama. Weiss's version of Tuscaloosa Nights fills in the narrative gaps of Carmer's memoir, attempting to reckon with horrors that Carmer left unexamined. So I'll give you an example of that. Flaming Cross, that's the Carmer, the section, the sort of vignette that is a part of his Tuscaloosa Nights section. It ends with Carmer and his old friend and guide, Pinion Knox, who's also a character in Weiss's story, riding away from the Klan rally in stunned silence as Carmer considers how, quote, the lights of town seemed friendlier than the flames we had left behind, unquote. Carmer then quickly changes the subject, asking to accompany Pinion when he goes vote grabbing the following week. So the sort of horrifying scene of a Klan rally just sort of hangs there for a moment before Carmer changes the subject and moves on, both in the text and sort of like in the reader's mind. Weiss's Tuscaloosa Nights significantly alters Carmer's ending and really everything about the story besides the name and these few lines. In the immediate aftermath of the Ku Klux Klan rally, Marla, who is the sort of narrative voice of Weiss's story and the kind of northern stand-in for Carl Carmer in Weiss's story, Marla is unable to forget an earlier moment when she and Pinion found his black servant Puddin, quote, cramped and afraid under the steering wheel of Pinion's car. This moment situates the Klan rally more broadly and identifies the narrative absences of the story's source material and even the limits of its own vision. In so doing, it critiques the ostensibly real account of Carmer's memoir, calling attention to the Southern cultural order that Carmer's text conceals. The most dramatic example of this sort of intertextual response to Carmer's memoir occurs moments later when Pinion forces himself on Marla in the back seat of his car. And this all happens sort of after the Klan rally in Weiss's story. While struggling to escape, Marla sees a, quote, flash of white out the window and assumes that it, quote, was a Klansman with a horsewhip come to punish them for what they would understand not as rape, but as a sexual transgression, just unmarried people in a car. So in this moment, and I know I'm just sort of giving you a little bit to go on here, but just sort of bear with me and take my word for it and read the story, please. Weiss kind of recasts Pinion, who's a sort of benevolent friend of Carl Carmer in the memoir, as a violent opportunist who's very much a part of the same white paternalistic culture of the Klan that they see around them, and that Pinion kind of creates distance from himself, kind of like creates distance between himself and what they see, but Weiss kind of collapses that. All of this is to say that Tuscaloosa Nights uses its contemporary vantage point to re-examine the horrifying facets of Southern power structures that Carmer misses, glosses, or omits. We should see how intertextuality operates in this moment, but also a lot more generally, as a valid point of access from which to understand and critique the longstanding concerns and assumptions of Southern cultures and Southern literature. And there's another pretty famous example, fairly recent and pretty famous example of this sort of move, which is Alice Randall's 2001 reinterpretation of Gone with the Wind, entitled The Wind Done Gone. What's really interesting about that example is that it actually went to court, where it was decided that Randall's novel, which retells much of Mitchell's novel from the perspective of an enslaved woman, did in fact, and this is from the court proceedings, appropriate numerous characters, settings, and plot twists from Gone with the Wind. So that's in the realm of plagiarism, which was the sort of the decision being made: should this novel be allowed to be published? However, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that Randall's intertextual revision, which shares many of the techniques and much of the spirit of the Bear Bryant Funeral Train, was protected by fair use as a parody, particularly one that offered a more historically accurate treatment of the institution of slavery than that of its source material. The interesting thing about Karl Carmer's memoir in light of all this is that Weiss's text was far from the first to use it as source material. Stars Fell in Alabama inspired many acts of intertextual interpretation before Weiss's. And I'm going to get into stuff that probably a lot of folks already know, but countless musicians immediately used the memoir's title in recordings of the song Stars Fell in Alabama, which was originally written and composed by Mitchell Parrish and Frank Perkins. In fact, so many notable musicians ranging from Ella Fitzgerald to Jimmy Buffett recorded versions of that song that it became a really ubiquitous phrase, one that was eventually etched onto Alabama license plates until 2009. The mythologizing of Carmer's memoir through its own title and the text contents, it kind of divorced that title and what it meant and where it came from its original context, and it abstracted those relationships over time. The legacy of Carmer's memoir shows that when reading the history of the South, we cannot ignore the way texts produce and proliferate realities of their own. And the point I'm driving at here is that texts end up producing a sort of reality. If texts end up producing a sort of reality, rather, then how different is a history of text from simply history, which of course is not underwritten by copyright. Furthermore, the work Weiss's text performs brings the specific reality of Carmer's memoir back into clear view and allows readers to reinterpret the seeming banality of the state's longtime slogan. And I want to also just point out that nobody was really reading Karl Carmer's memoir when this happened. So, it also probably had a real material effect for that text as well. Okay, I want to end by talking about the stories, or about the collection's titular story, The Bear Bryant Funeral Train, which is a really totally bizarre story that I love for a lot of reasons, but so many of the things I've talked about play out actually within the content of that story. It's set in a Tuscaloosa of the near future that hardly resembles the setting of Tuscaloosa Nights, Weiss's version, or Carmer's, I suppose. It's set largely in Vance, Alabama, in the Mercedes factory that is just outside of Tuscaloosa, and that's a real auto plant that has been producing cars since, I think, 1997. The story is one of global corporate espionage. It's going to be really hard to describe in the few moments I have left, but I hope you'll read it because it's bizarre and really fascinating. But here's sort of the context the novel, or the story sets up. Chrysler-Benz has bought Anheuser-Busch, which already owns Busch Gardens and Six Flags, in an effort to compete with Disney in the realm of mega theme parks. Sonny, who's the main character in this story, is a University of Alabama trained engineer who studied also in a German interdisciplinary architecture program. And he's tasked with creating a prototype of the Mercedes that's owned by, it's a subsidiary of all these other companies. He's tasked with creating a prototype of the company's first theme park ride. The story investigates Sonny's last project, in some ways his life's work, in the days leading up to his retirement. The project is a filmic model for a theme park ride based on Paul Bear Bryant's funeral, and that's Paul Bear Bryant, famed Alabama football coach. The Super 8 film Sonny compiles relies upon both footage of Bryant's real funeral, which, if you ever read about it, was it's one of the biggest funerals in American history, probably. It was a huge funeral. It relies on footage of Bryant's real funeral and recordings of other world leaders from the same era. Sonny splices them into Bryant's dirge, declaring that, quote, "the truth is not enough to capture the cultural significance of his funeral." And this is a longer quote from the story, Sonny thinking about what he's made. "The Bear Bryant Funeral Train is not a real document. It is a computer-generated film made to look like a document. I've given the film the grainy look and feel of celluloid to make the events that are to follow more or less plausible. Even though my movie is based on a true story, the truth is not enough." Unquote. In an effort to capture the mythic significance of Bryant, Sonny designs a film that resembles a documentary, but of course is fiction. Indeed, the film is kaleidoscopic and hardly literal in its scope and imagery, beginning with local highlights like former football players in the university's $1 Million Band, both of which were part of the real funeral train, and slowly swallowing up cultural images from around the globe. And this is just a few of them. Parliamentarians from The Hague, senators from the Knesset, Politburo members, and eventually a caravan of oil sheiks from the Yemen, a drunk and choleric Soviet Prime Minister Andropov, and Idi Amin in a sky blue El Dorado convertible. Sonny even includes images of John Lennon and Johnny Weissmuller waving to the caravan. The second to last float carries the eldest son of Ho Chi Minh, Bin Phu, who has come to America to research Civil War reenactments. So you can see just like the sort of bizarre context that Weiss locates the legacy of Bryant within. Bryant in this model is a demagogue, Sunny says, adding that, quote, he carried the cult of personality aura similar to that of Hitler and Gandhi. He was our patriarch, and we revered him as a sort of superlative invention of the South. He was our Nietzsche and houndstooth, wielding his gridiron will to power like an axe handle, a walking tall redneck Ubermensch. That's the end of the quote. There's a lot more I can say about the story. I don't want to give away the end because there are a few more really interesting twists and turns that I hope you'll read and enjoy. I will end by pointing out, though, that what Sunny does in this story, splicing together real footage of Bryant's funeral with things that seem to capture the spirit of the event, but are obviously not things that happened, is to me pretty similar to Weiss's broader project of working with the many texts he had at hand, the history of Tuscaloosa in literature. This to me is one of the things that makes the collection so fascinating. It asks big questions about the viability of what I've called intertextual sampling, both in the processes that Weiss used and that of his characters. And the answers it provides are fascinating, complex, and even often self-critical. But it can only push us to think about those questions if it's granted the opportunity to exist and be read. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matthew. And now we'll turn it over to Dawn to hear about William Gay.
Mute and share screen. Trying to make sure. Am I sharing this? Okay, can you all see that? Okay, good. Okay, so as if you have an image of William Gay and what he looks like while I'm talking about him. Thanks for having me, everybody, and thank you for showing up today. I'm going to start with a kind of a background on William Gay, and then we're going to talk a little bit about his paintings. I have some slides for you to see of those, and chat about the future for William, and what y'all can do to keep his voice relevant. So William Gay was born in Lewis County, Tennessee, sometime between 1939 and 1943. His family celebrates his birthday October 27th, but the date and year are questionable. William was known to give different records of birth as well, but I guess we all lie about our birth date. He grew up very poor. His parents never owned a car. They didn't have electricity. They counted on kerosene light. His father actually worked in Hollandwood and would walk 6 miles to and from to a wood mill where he cut railroad ties until the family moved off of Grinders Creek. And some of you may recognize that location as a setting in his novels and his stories. He moved there around the age of 15. Now, the property in Grinders Creek was close to his grandparents, and one of his earliest memories is walking the wooded path with his brother Cody and telling these stories of a hero cowboy that he had invented. So the call to write came to William at a very early age, but the family was so impoverished that they didn't have pens or pencils available, so he would literally crush up walnut shells to make ink and use a stick to write with. He was a voracious reader, and there was a small library there. And one of his teachers noticed that he was reading kind of junk literature and turned him on to a copy of Look Homeward, Angel by Thomas Wolfe. Now, this book was instrumental in changing William Gay's life. At that point, he saw the characters becoming more alive than his own life. And he, at that point, decided that he was determined to be a writer. But you have to remember that Lewis County school systems was ranked one of the lowest in the country as far as education goes. And so he dedicated himself to consuming literature of all kinds. He graduated high school, he joined the Navy, and was stationed off the coast of Vietnam. But he was not much of a fighter, and he didn't care much for authority. He actually ended up in the Village for a while, and he claims that he met Janis Joplin. In fact, he asked her to play a Bob Dylan song, and she said that she didn't do requests. And Bob Dylan was kind of getting him in trouble all of his life. There's some really funny short memoirs in his collections about Bob Dylan and how that he was always getting in trouble with Bob Dylan. But he returns to Tennessee, but the work is scarce. And him and his brother end up in Chicago working and living in kind of a redneck ghetto. Eventually, he comes back to Hollandwood, Tennessee, where he will live the rest of his life until he passes. He got married and had 4 kids. And during this time, he's reading and writing. but he also has to have a day job. So he works carpentry and he hangs drywall and he paints, but he considers these kind of manual labor jobs to be, these are not his real job. So he works sporadically. During the day, he's constantly writing in his head, and then he comes home and he would write longhand in notebooks. But the fact that he he just basically wrote, he worked to write, it got him kind of in trouble with his wife, and so it did not bode well for his marriage, because he would just work enough to pay the bills, and then he would quit and hunt ginseng in the woods, and then do his real job, which is writing. He never really mastered the typewriter or a computer, and so when he started sending work out, he sent it in longhand, and of course he was getting rejected for sending handwritten work out. Eventually he gets a typewriter, and his daughters typed up some short stories for him. But one of the things that he was doing, and I think a lot of authors, people you think, oh, I want to be published in New York, or I want to be published in Atlantic. He started sending to these, big dog publishers, and of course he was getting rejected by them. He eventually realizes that he should send his work to some of the smaller presses. And in 1998, he gets accepted by the Georgia Review and the Missouri Review at the same time. And the editor of the Missouri Review was instrumental in getting his first novel, The Long Home, published. Of course, William had other novels because he'd been writing all his life, just kind of sitting there. And that was really well received, and it got a lot of good reviews. And so then in 2000, he gets on with Doubleday and Provinces of Night comes out. And from there, it just kind of takes off. He finally is able to make money from his writing full time. He becomes a Guggenheim Fellow. He wins the William Penn Award. He goes to literary conferences and book tours to promote his work. And he's finally at this point in the late 1990s and early 2000s where he's getting the recognition and he has some notoriety and success, and he's achieving his life's goals. And then he passes away in 2012, and he passes away without a will. So the big publishers are nervous because of issues of chain of title. And then, of course, he also wrote in longhand, and the job of transcribing this work, transcribing his work, because he didn't use commas or hyphens. He wasn't fond of, crossing, dotting I's and crossing T's. He didn't do that. So it was a true act of love from his friends and family and the team that got together to transcribe that work and then type it up and then edit it, because it's very difficult to read. I'm going to show you a notebook of what I'm talking about. And then some of his work was just sort of scattered all over the place in various attics of his daughters and, that kind of thing. In fact, Fugitives of the Heart, which is being published by the University of Alabama. It should come out this June or this summer. That manuscript was stolen from his trailer at Grinders Creek. And there's a great introduction to the book from Sonny Brewer about he was there when he dropped William off. And he discovered that his manuscript was stolen, which is kind of like the worst thing that can happen to an author. But that's since been recovered. So that's kind of the stuff that has happened has caused problems in terms of him to potentially becoming a completely lost Southern author. And also you have to remember that he was completely self-taught. He didn't go to college. He didn't have the advantage of professors or a peer group that could help him or support him and say, hey, I got this great writer, or introduce him to publishers or anything like that. And of course, he worked his day job sometimes, but he remained committed to working. And he didn't get published until he was almost 60 years old, but he remained dedicated. And I just sort of look at him as this genius living in obscurity, that we just didn't even know about in rural Tennessee. That's how I got attracted to trying to advocate for him. But if you want to learn more about William Gay as far as his background and his biography, Michael White, who is the lead archivist, is going to be publishing a biography in the future. And then also you can just Google William Gay Archive, and it has a lot more, and those funny stories about Bob Dylan as well. Now, in terms of his prose, most compare him to William Faulkner or Cormac McCarthy, Carson McCullers. I think his characterization is very similar to Flannery O'Connor. In fact, I think pretty much all of his antagonists are based on the misfit from a good man is hard to find. I mean, that's probably true for for all Southern writers, at least, because that was the ultimate villain, my favorite villain. He was also a symbolic writer like O'Connor, lots of snakes and calendars, whippoorwills. His prose is adjectival, full of similes and metaphors. It's heavily layered and poetic. There's a lot of attention paid to word choice and placement. He used archaic words, and he even invented some words. When he was young, his brother Cody said that someone gave him a copy of a dictionary, and he read it from front to end, and sort of like, hoarding those words for later on. So, I mean, he definitely falls under, these famous authors that I just mentioned. In fact, he became friends with McCarthy. He called him up, he looked him up because he found out he lived in Tennessee. And they start talking on the phone and sending each other's works. And for people who are fans of William Gay and Cormac McCarthy, Springer Mountain Press is going to be publishing that correspondence later on this year. And that is going to be a huge treat for everybody. He definitely belongs on those shelves with our quintessential Southern Gothic writers, but I also believe he could easily fit on the shelves with magical realism authors, and here's why. There's just a plethora of supernatural elements within his entire body of work. And I know that Southern Gothic writers have that element too. There's usually the grotesque and delusional figure, haunted settings, themes of death and decay. But I think those are largely explained away as a realist text, as a South trying to reconcile with its past, its old violence, slavery, poverty, oppression, environmental devastation, just even displacement. I think all of that is present in Gay's work, but I think he was doing something different from his contemporaries, and that's because of what I said, the sheer number of references suggests the supernatural. There's more than an undercurrent of magic in his landscape. It's not full fantasy, but it's always present. Now, Gay was familiar with characters who claimed to possess powers, and Brady Bloodworth from Provinces of Night, the clairvoyant uncle of Fleming Bloodworth, was inspired by Gay's real Uncle Scott, who claimed to possess this gift of second sight. Uncle Scott was a legend, and he was very famous, and people would travel wide to hear their fortunes read. But his entire body of work is pretty peppered with witches, fortune tellers, wizard type characters, ghosts, cursed families, omens, and even a necromancer. Although necromancer, necrophiliac, you just kind of have to play with that. If you read his works from a speculative fiction point of view, it changes his narratives altogether. It changes his endings. They become less vague. It makes the world he created, the haunted forest of the Hurricane, much scarier. And I ultimately think these supernatural events and characters place William into a speculative fiction writer or a horror genre writer, or at least an author that was genre bending. And speaking of genre bending, I also think of William as a great world-building author. And I believe that these speculative fiction-like elements, these characters, these settings, the dark, poetic language full of terms that you would normally associate with books about the occult, help him establish a Southern folklore. It gives his landscapes a saga, a past, a history. And I often compare him to J.R. Tolkien because most people are familiar with Tolkien, and also because these two authors shared the same methodology. They were intimately aware of their environments, the flora, the fauna, the terrain, the weather. They both used fairy tales, fables, legends, regional folklore to construct a legendarium. And they both used maps and illustrations. Let me share this again here. I can hardly see where I'm supposed to share this thing. Maybe it'll work. There we go. So just to give you an idea of him illustrating his Southern folklore, these are the covers we can see Lolita and Iceman cover, and then Time Been Done Won't Be No More. His images of the painting, they kind of have this haunting, kind of dark quality. And then, he painted from a very young age as well, and entirely self-taught as well. He's painted a lot of paintings. We want to get an exhibit done at some point. He wanted to use all of his images on his covers, but the bigger publishers wouldn't go for that. And so that's something that the team has been adamant about doing. Like in the future, when we get something published, we want to have his stuff on the cover. This is another one. These are the ones that are up for raffle too. So if you do win these books, you're gonna get a little piece of art along with his prose. He painted pastoral settings. And for me, it's like a little Easter egg hunt, because if you are reading his prose and then you find something that you can kind of match up with his paintings, it's very satisfying. He didn't title his work, so we don't know for sure, except for one that's kind of titled. And then this is a map. I was telling you how it's not that easy to see. I've identified some of the main places Ackerman's filled. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Itchy Mamas is a bootlegger. This is like the Town Psychopaths, Snow White Cafe. These are like reoccurring settings that show up in his short stories and his novels throughout his entire body of work. And some of the characters show up as well. Sheriff Bellwether, he's always depicted as the same type of character. It's hard to make out, but there's mile markers as well. And then the Harricans on one side, and that's his haunted forest, and then Ackerman's filled. And then there's some real places that were in Tennessee that he's just sort of blended in, which is another thing that like Pilkin did. And when I say act of love, this is what I'm talking about. That he would write in every single inch that he had available. He didn't waste any pages, including like the covers of these notebooks. It's pretty wild. And then I didn't put all of his work up here. These are the novels, forthcoming stuff that's coming out. Obviously, he's been published in a lot of literary journals and magazines, his musical criticism, anthologies, but this just kind of gives you like the biggest stuff. And forthcoming, this is exciting. Like I said, Fugitives of the Heart's coming out from the University of Alabama in 2021. We don't have a title on the Springer Mountain Press one, but it's a collection. And like I said, that correspondence is going to be in there. There's going to be images of his paintings in there as well. And then the cover will feature one of his paintings. The ride's not over yet. I don't know if that's going to be 2021 or 2022. But that's some work that you've never seen before. It's really great. I provided editorial assistance on some of this, and it was just such a joy and pleasure to do it. And then also we have Joseph Tidwell in Mississippi is adapting his novels to movie scripts, and we're talking about building a William Gay Society as sort of like a platform to promote his work, kind of house it, and encourage people to write scholarly the articles about his work, because there's really not a lot out there. When I was doing my master's thesis, I was like, wow, I mean, there's so much to write about. There's so many good topics to cover, but there hasn't been a lot done in terms of that. And I also want to use that platform for fiction writers that want to carry on in the tradition of William Gay. And here's some homework for everybody. Yeah, so I really hope that people consider including William Gay in their syllabus. And I was hoping that by introducing him as a potential magical realism writer and also as a world building author, that if you had to, let's say you have to put the Faulkner in there or the Cormac McCarthy in there or the Flannery O'Connor as under Southern Gothic, here's another way that you can combine William Gay into your syllabus. And you know, where you don't have to just typecast him in this one category of Southern Gothic writers, because he was doing so many different things, and he did want to write in different genres. He wrote Little Sister Death, which was inspired on the Bell Witch legend as a horror novel. And then he wrote a detective novel too. So he wanted to write in all different types of genres, but publishers don't like that. You got one good thing, they want you to stick with it. So that was kind of another thing that kind of works against them. And then we need students to write literary articles and get these published in book clubs. Hey, you guys are going to be winning these books, so you can discuss it. Libraries need to stock their shelves, purchase, and everybody, if you're a fan of an author, you should write reviews, because that's their lifeline. They really need it. In the future, we're hoping that we can find exhibit space, because there's just a ton of artwork, and combine discussions about his art and his prose. So, I mean, there's a lot of good things on the, we're looking forward to doing, but it also counts on everybody to support this as well. And I actually want to end with, a passage from the book that's coming out, Fugitives of the Heart. This is a scene where the young Yates, he's the main character of it. He comes to Ackerman's Field and he has the first time experiencing fireworks. And I think this passage depicts everything that I said about him having this sort of like poet writer. It's layered imagery. There's myth woven into it. It's just a very sensual passage. So, okay. Yates, he peered up, eyes wide and wonder-struck, into the blackness where green and red fire toiled away in showers of burning phosphorus. until the sparks died and the skies were blacker than he'd ever seen them. Another burst, illuminating a vast drifting octopus of smoke, like the dark spectral shade of the one previous, and the sky was lit by a vast Medusa of fire. Colored serpents writhing in the darkness with gold and silver cascading downward as a pyramid of fire covered the horizon. I mean, I've read that like 15 times. It's just so wonderful. I hope you guys think so as well. And that concludes the discussion on William, but if anyone wants to reach out to me, feel free. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dawn, Eli, Matthew. Wonderful presentations. It's so funny. It's like I never considered William Gay kind of lost. It was because I met him at the book festival. He was at a couple of the Decatur book festivals. And I was trying to remember when you were presenting which ones they actually were. I believe it was like this, I referred to it as the Sunday that went sideways. It was one of the first festivals, and this is before we added like the big churches and things like that. And I believe William was paired up with like Sonny Brewer or Clyde Edgerton or something like that on a Sunday in our auditorium at the library. And it's a nice sized auditorium, but it caps out at 200 people. And people camped out. And they wouldn't leave. And people outside were angry because they wanted in. And I was like, well, I can't force people to leave a public building. That's, not what libraries do. But yeah, it was truly insane. And that's why I just never, his art is beautiful and his writing has always been beautiful, but I guess it's like for the people that were always in the know about William Gay's fiction, you never do consider those people kind of lost because they're always around and like on your shelf and things like that.
I mean, he was I definitely think that if there wasn't this team and these people who loved him so much, that it could have really been lost, because there's work that just, like I said, it was stolen, and recovering that. It's been really wonderful.
Yeah, that reminds me too of the story about Lillian Smith, the fire at the Lillian Smith cabin, and some of her manuscripts were lost.
Oh yeah.
And just, who knows what could have been.
Yeah, devastating.
But, before computers and hard drives and clouds that keep things safe for us, this just became lost. So, well, if anyone has any questions, don't forget, type them into the chat or use the Q&A feature, and I will go ahead and start collecting those. Wonderful comments coming in, of course, for all of you saying that they're very interesting, given people several writers to research now. But would like to ask Eli, let me scroll, are there any of Hartsock's works that are currently in print?
No, they're all out of print, and most of them are pretty small runs because it was a boutique press, and so a lot of libraries here in Georgia have them because he was so big in Atlanta, but very little. Some of the poems you can find online, Strange Splendor because it won the Poetry Award, but most of it's completely out of print.
And actually, I'm going to go ahead and follow up with you for a question from Gina. And she asks, with your skill set as a research librarian, could you offer some more general advice for those of us wanting to begin archival research on lost Southern voices and where to begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. Luckily, I can't imagine doing research on a lost Southern writer, 20 years ago. But now it's so much easier with sources being digitized. The Digital Library of Georgia is a great resource for newspapers especially. And a lot of the writers, it seems like back in the time when Hartsock was writing, they were published in the newspapers, and the newspapers covered everything. If you went out of town to visit your sister, sometimes the Atlanta Journal covered it, so there's a lot of stuff in newspapers, and a lot of that's been digitized. So Digital Library of Georgia, and even Google Books. Google works with a lot of publishers for things that are out of copyright to get them digitized. And you can search Google Books for some of the older things, especially, Hartsock's out of copyright now because it's so long ago, so, starting with Google Books or Digital Library of Georgia are great places to start. And then it leads you to, other sources, pretty quickly. Archive Grid is one as well. That's kind of a database for most archives in the country where it's all in one search. So you can search that and it'll tell you if the History Center or UGA has information about an author.
Excellent. You've also been asked to read one of Hartsock's poems. So if you'd like to do that, you are more than free. I can ask someone else a question while you pick one, if that would give you a minute.
Sure.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, let's go to Matthew, and it is a question about the Bear Bryant funeral train and, of course, The Wind Done Gone. And so Monica asks, I understand why the Mitchell estate went after Randall because Gone with the Wind is so revered. Why was Weiss such a target? Was it because of the reverence for Bear Bryant?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think I think with the Mitchell estate, it's not only that Mitchell was revered, but that there was a real cash imperative, and there continues to be a cash imperative to keep those to keep the rights protected on that novel. But that's an aside. There's like a broad, complex answer to that question about Weiss. I don't think it has much to do with Bear Bryant, to be honest. But the initial response to his book, when I read about it, I wasn't aware of it when it happened, but when I read about it, sort of and research it from the back end, it really seems like people sort of have like a feeling of kind of like catching someone, right? And who wasn't prepared to have been caught. When if you look at Brad's dissertation, which I have, the epigraphs are all over it. It's very clear that this was like an intellectual project that he was really invested in for a long time. So the publication with UGA Press, I think taking epigraphs off, right, kind of removing all the markers that pointed directly at what he was doing. I understand why he and the press would want to do that, but I think it kind of opened him up in the way that in the way that we saw. The other really interesting part of this, and I'll just gesture toward it, there's an article, and I think it's linked on the Wikipedia page for Brad Weiss, because so much of this has to do with Wikipedia, actually. There's an article that was published in Salon probably 7 or 8 years ago at this point, about a Wikipedia editor who knew Brad Weiss and was a part of the kind of literary world that he moved through, namely at the Sewanee Writers Conference, who sort of went after him online and was on a crusade to basically undermine his work and describe what he had done as plagiarism. And the article that was published by Salon, makes it clear that the perspective there is that it was really personal for this guy. And so there was this kind of really strange cloak and dagger campaign to get his to sort of take down his work, and then I think the general response by like librarians in Tuscaloosa and readers was like, wait a second, this guy's done something, and I've caught him. So I think it was a kind of a really strange combination of factors, but in the years since, I think cooler heads have kind of prevailed, and it's sort of too late in some ways for this book. I don't even know if River City Publishing, the press that eventually published it out of Montgomery, is even existing anymore. It's hard to get your hands on a copy of either edition of the book, the one that was pulped or the one that was reissued. But I most of the reception now is, I think, at least open to the idea that what he was doing had a basis in a kind of intellectual project.
I actually did have my hands on a copy of that when it won the Flannery O'Connor Award,
Yes.
and I coveted it, and I was hoping that when the person retired that they would gently leave it in their office and I could just sort of take possession of it. That didn't happen. But it's interesting though, because that happened around the time that sort of there seemed to be a lot of scandals in the publishing industry at that time. J.T. Leroy and James Fry and even Stephen Ambrose was sort of like suffering from that, and it just seemed that every quarter you turned around and someone in the publishing industry was being unmasked as a plagiarist or lifting things. I mean, I did manage to find, The Wind Done Gone with the unauthorized parody sticker slapped on it. I guess that made that acceptable as a first edition, was to call it an unauthorized parody. But so we do have a few more questions, and Dawn, I'm just going to go ahead and prepare you. There's a lot of William Gay questions, so it could be a whole nother William Gay session in 2022.
I hope so.
Excellent. But Eli, if you have that poem ready to go, we will go ahead and let you read the Hartsock poem.
Sure. I picked a short one. And Strange Splendor, the one he won the prize for, is really good. But that one can be, if you Google Ernest Hartsock, Strange Splendor, that comes up. I think JSTOR has made that public because it's old. But Brief Abandon was one of his other ones. In the last, the first two books, you can find copies on like ABE Books or even Amazon. The last one, Strange Splendor, you can't as much because that was after he died and they just didn't publish as many. He was popular for half a second and then, people kind of forget about you, but this is Brief Abandon from Strange Splendor. This is a day for daisies. Let us go like swallows down the highways of the air, and we shall find the daisies like a snow suspended on the hills of everywhere. Give me your hand. Throughout woodlands dark and sweet, we shall float gladly like the wanton feather, with reckless hearts and summer-haunted feet. Do not delay, we are not long together. And days of brief abandon will not come when we are underground, so let us yield to blood that battles in us like a drum, and find the beast of beauty in a field. There will be days for tears and dust hereafter. This is a day for daisies and for laughter.
And just a quick follow-up while we have you there. Emery asks, do you have any thoughts about the question mark on Hartsock's birth certificate?
I don't know. I don't know what that means. That's a good question. I would be interested in, maybe you could give me an email, talk about that, because I don't know what that means, but I would be very interested in that.
It sounds like a literary mystery. So
right.
Okay, Dawn. So here are a few for you about William Gay, and I think you may have answered the one about keeping his work alive, by assigning it and really working with scholars, and keeping things published. But we have a question from Alyssa that says, you mentioned that William Gay can be considered to be a magical realist writer. Are there specific short stories that you would recommend to display those qualities?
I mean, honestly, I think his entire body of work is like that. Probably the one that resonated with me the most is the novel Twilight. It really is just this like dark fairy tale, and in fact, William compared it to Hansel and Gretel in one of his interviews. But I mean, I know she mentioned the paper hanger. Yeah, that one definitely has those haunting qualities. But I think I would probably maybe take excerpts if you're trying to teach, maybe take excerpts from it. Particularly like the intro to where they enter the Hurricane. When they actually enter the Hurricane as this haunted forest, he stops and starts writing in this like second person point of view, and you is setting up going into this haunted place, and it's not, he even says it's you're going backwards in time. So there's these weird things. He plays a lot around with time. It's almost like doesn't really exist, and it's very warped once you get into the Hurricane. But I think any time, and I can leave my email if you want to directly email me about that. I can get you like a list that I think are the best off the top of my head. Yeah, the paper hanger, because that's his most anthologized and probably famous short story. But I think that, all of it is just full of it. I always can find a witch. I can always find someone like that, a ghost. And I don't think that they're necessarily delusional, mad people. I think they're actually there. So,
and we also have a question from Jeannie. Did the William Gay estate get settled, and who owns his work?
Okay, so the lead archivist is the executor of the state, and then he works with the family. So the family will get like whatever. He gets very little in terms of what comes out in the future. Now the archive, a lot of the stuff is stored at University of the South. So that was all gathered, and like these notebooks and stuff are there. But then he also, like the lead archivist, has been collecting, that's Michael White, has been collecting paintings because they sort of surface, and even the work is surfaced. Like the family, they might need some money or something, so they sell like a painting or whatever. So we're trying to kind of get it in one place, and that's one of the goals. Is, I mean, there's going to be some that's going to be all over the place, and right when you think there's like no more work out there, something happens. So that's great. That's a joy.
So let me ask, because there's a lot of the questions coming in, and I'll try and get those to you. And maybe Dawn, you can answer those via email for folks.
Yeah, I can do that.
Out of time. But we do have a question for all three of you. And the question is from Carrie, and she asks, when exploring lost voices, we often hear about the difficulties, maybe in life or in publication experience, that prevent that voice from being more recognized and heard. If the panelists were suddenly granted the power of one magical wish, what one thing would they change in order to alter their subject's legacy and bring more attention to their work?
Well,
I think we need the Jeopardy music.
I would like him to have lived like at least another 20 years. I would alter his death. I know that's crazy, but it just right when it was all happening, then it just, he dies. And then the fact that he didn't have a will, it just slowed everything down. And then there was a situation, and I mean, these publishers were rightfully concerned because his first book came out and his wife said that she wrote it. So they had to go to court. And of course, she didn't know what it was about. The judge asked her what it was about. She didn't know what it was about. But, those kind of things happen in families, and they get really weird when you die without a will. You know how it is. You hear, and so with his work, one, I wish I could change that he didn't die. The other, maybe that he didn't die without a will.
Matthew, do you want to go ahead and take up that question?
Yeah, sure. I don't know. This is such an interesting counterfactual. I guess something I think about, I don't want to pile on or blame or sound embittered. I think I kind of wish more writers and especially UGA Press had Brad Weiss's back in the moment when all this stuff happened. It does seem like there was a pretty clear case to explain what he was doing that wasn't really, didn't really depend on a really dense intellectual explanation that I probably gave today. I think this is sort of an easy print history question to answer. So yeah, I guess I think you made a really great point, Joe, that this all happened during a moment when there was a sort of appetite to be on the lookout for plagiarism and to take down writers who were sort of falsifying something about their persona. And I think he probably got caught up in that, and the sort of what the press did, the way other people talked about it or didn't talk about it. Until sort of after things had already happened, when he did get a lot of support. I think some of that was just the moment. But that's what I'll say in response to that.
Thank you, Matthew. Eli?
Yeah, I think I wish I had, or had been able to start researching, Hartsock much earlier than I did. And granted, if, I don't know, if there had been interest in Hartsock, 40 years ago, that there would have been a lot of folks that had known him that could have been interviewed, and at this point, there's maybe, there would be anybody that even crossed paths with him. I mean, they'd be, 91, it's been 91 years since he died, so it's like, that's lost. Luckily, a lot of, sort of minor poets and minor writers would give their papers to UGA or Emory or the History Center. So there is a lot of archival stuff from, these folks that are just not well known, which is nice, because you can do the primary research, but I wish I had started researching a lot earlier, even earlier in my life. There would have still been, folks that had crossed paths to get one-on-one, what was he like, versus, just the written record. So.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. And what I see some of you have been answering questions in the chat and giving your emails. So please, if I didn't have a chance to ask your question and get it answered here in the chat, do reach out to our panelists. Be gentle. We're all living in like an email virtual age right now. Inboxes are full and such. But I would like to, of course, tell you that we will be doing a raffle for 2 William Gay books. So I will be contacting you via email if you've won to let you know. We're going to give you a copy of Stone Burner and Time Done Been Won't Be No More are for the raffle this afternoon. Also, don't forget we have another session at 4 p.m. about James Baldwin and how James Baldwin is being taught to incarcerated individuals and their reflections on James Baldwin as well. Once again, thank you, Dawn, Eli, and Matthew. Thank you to everyone who, of course, joined us this afternoon and let us come into your homes to talk about these wonderful authors. And hopefully, if you did not know about them, maybe you found someone you go need to find a book. And by the way, I've also been looking on sources right now and know that Bear Bryant funeral train goes for about $139. So I'm going to get a cheap one. I hope you do too. And we will see you all again very, very soon. Thanks so very much.